But that would justify Lanzmann, I mean, in a way.
Absolutely, no, and I also I realized I was reading this that it sounds like I'm just related to that I hate Lanzmann or something, and Lanzmann I think absolutely is. I mean, I think it's also a question of history, right? He made that 40 years out, and there were survivors to interview, and we're almost that much time again, and things at this historical moment that we live in is very different. But I don't think Lanzmann is unjustified in what he made. I think he's unjustified maybe in the early 2000s to be saying thou shalt not read that photograph. That's a different kind of move, you know. But so I think there is a kind of a real sense in a lot of trauma theory that absence and the breakdown of representation is really the kind of the site of the traumatic truth, and where I would see the success, and it's only ever partial, and it's all shot through with holes, you know, the post-memory, is that you don't have any, I mean, you have this kind of prosthesis within, if you're traumatic, you have this traumatic experience somewhere, you know, that kind of in you, sort of external, internal exteriority, right, of the kind of traumatic kernel, or the unclaimed experience, or whatever you want to call it. Whereas you really have to kind of hear stories, and you have to see images and see documents to even get post-memory, right? I mean, there is a kind of, it is mediated, it's hyper-mediated, right, in a way that I think is very important, that it's really, it is a play of representations that creates it's the precondition of post-memory, right? So in that sense, I think that they are meaningfully distinguishable.
Just one last comment with trauma also, that if sometimes when you read Holocaust memoir, something that is sort of the most traumatic event is also the event that is not experienced, but not in the sense because you don't only experience, but because, you know, your mother was selected to the left, you to the right, and you imagine what happened to her and you don't know. So there's also this distance that is a different one, that is part of.
Right.
So I don't know, I just see a lot of fuzziness when I try to actually, it's actually my own difficulty to really define what the difference is. I guess what I'm saying.
Yeah, and in real memoirs, it's a very different thing. But I mean, I'm thinking of especially of like what I think are very extreme kind of statements. I mean, when you have like Agamben or something who's, I mean, he's really fixated on the figure of the musulman, right, who can't speak, and so the kind of ethical position that we have to kind of listen to that which can't be said, and so everything else is kind of trivial. Because, I mean, in memoirs, he doesn't care, he doesn't read that stuff, you know, it's like what you have to kind of listen to what can't be said, and what anything could be said, he says is not interesting, you know, so it's kind of this trivialization of actual survivor memoirs. I think that stuff is just not, what does he read in a memoir besides Primo Levi and then Criminal, if you really look carefully at how he reads it. So.
Well, I wonder, I mean, it seems to me that one of the vehicles that you're using to kind of distinguish post-memory and trauma has to do with space and spatiality, right? Sort of these, you know, these motifs of interiority and exteriority. And so that, I mean, that kind of makes sense to me, but I wonder if the issue there is that it's not so much a question of distinction versus indistinction versus, as it is interdependence versus non-interdependence, because I do think, you know, if you think about it in those kinds of terms of exteriority and interiority, I think the notion of this kind of interdependent circuit, you know, of trauma and post-memory starts to emerge. And I think actually the detection, the comparison to the detective novels glosses that very nicely. I mean, if you think about, like, you know, particularly American detective novel tradition, like, you know, Chandler, whom you mentioned, but also Dashiell Hammett and James Cain, like, I think in a lot of those kinds of novels there is this sort of circuit between the detection of the external and the sort of recognition of the internal relationship to it, you know, and that's you know, which is occluded, you know, in a lot of different ways, but you know, and so the ways in which it actually overlaps with the external detection narrative sort of varies from case to case. But I think that there you see played out, you know, in this very clear sort of allegorical sense, you know, this kind of dynamic of interiority and exteriority that I wonder if it's a kind of similar circuit to what you're saying about trauma and post-memory.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's actually sort of the crux of the why I think it might be helpful to think of surrealism in some ways, along with post-memory, which may be a crazy idea, but why not? That surrealism kind of is really this question of the interior and the exterior. I mean, sort of to do a crazy thing like read, you know, the the external world as a kind of archive of inner experience or something, or the found object as the kind of manifestation of the internal desire, and that kind of forging some kind of crazy link and a faith that link can be forged between sort of inner experience and the outer world. So that is in some ways, I also kind of wanted to do that as a provocation to say that post-memory is a really weird thing, that you're kind of behaving like a surrealist if you actually think that you're remembering things that you're not. That's likely not. You shouldn't naturalize post-memory. I think it's worthwhile sometimes to take it back and to think of it as a really strange operation that happens, and not to kind of think of it in terms of a naturalization of memory.
That's a very rich talk and very, very provocative. Thank you. I just have a comment and a question. The comment shores up or supports, I think, your association of modernism with detection, from the figure of the detective or detective novel. You may know that literature on postmodernism, I think one prominent critic, Brian McHale, on the postmodernist novel, that's the trope he uses for talk about modernism. The detective novel, the epistemological mode, in contrast to the postmodern novel, where he talks about the ontological mode and science fiction as the sort of analog to postmodernism or postmodernist fiction. The question I have, going back to this fellow again, Lanzmann, was key figure in all kinds of ways, and as you say, for hers as well. This film, this television film, in the Holocaust, he critiques, right? It came out in '78 in Germany, and this was really the first treatment of the Holocaust in Germany. What is your opinion of differentiating between that series? It focuses on a family, right? As a trivialized depiction of the Holocaust, and the effects that it had. Because this series, or maybe it wasn't a series, it was maybe 2 evenings in Germany.
Four, I think. It was 4 in the United States.
Yeah. It was as if a rock had been turned over, a giant rock in Germany, with all of these horrible creatures crawling out from under it, in a sense, a kind of therapeutic effect, really, on the unleashing all kinds of testimonies among the populace, just the population, the war widows coming out for the first time, talking about what their husbands had done, and this kind of thing, and affecting the textbooks, right? I mean, the history books, in really sort of major ways in Germany. How do you reconcile his critique, which you may or may not agree with those effects?
Right. I mean, I think that's you put it really well, and I would just sort of add on a little bit to that with the sort of context in Germany, and the question of affect. I mean, he's I think absolutely right to critique in some sense that it is kind of a Holocaust soap opera. It really is kind of it's completely weird coincidences and a love story, and it kind of. As sort of this guy who's sort of the Forrest Gump of the Holocaust and shows up at Lava Yar and everywhere else, happens to be a witness to everything, and it touches on all the, so it's very contrived and very emotionally manipulating, and on the other hand, as you say, and it's very much also, if you consider what the sort of high intellectual kind of reaction to the Holocaust was in Germany, which was very, like a real suspicion, I think, after National Socialism of affect in general, right? That we should be very coolly rationalistic, analytical. If you look at the important works, they were, Peter Weiss's The Ermittlung, The Investigation, and sort of docudrama, Hochhutsplay, The Sterblichkeit. These are all kind of very documentary works on the Holocaust, not very emotionally. Certainly emotionally engaging in some way, but not working through kind of affect and melodrama, right? And then you have this melodrama and everybody panned it before it came to Germany. All the German critics said this is American crap, and then the whole country freaks out, right? And it starts this discussion that none of that stuff did anything close to getting a discussion started, and then the whole country freaks out and changes the whole discussion. So I think there's a kind of revisiting of the place of affect. I mean, I tend to be pretty non-normative, I guess, in the way that I look at representations. I mean, there's things that I like, there's things that I don't like, and I think that, you know, that is an incredibly important, and in the United States as well, that's when the word Holocaust becomes a household term. That's the most important piece of, not the best piece of Holocaust art, but it's the most important in terms of popular memory of the Holocaust ever, of anything ever made, that TV series. Nobody, I mean, and think about it too, that when you had the big three, you had ABC, NBC, and I mean, half the country watched it, and in Germany, you probably had, you know, one channel or maybe two channels, and the whole country watched it. So you really had a national moment, kind of, and that was before you had 120 channels, you know, and kind of niche market. So that was really hugely important.
I just read Legacies of Silence with the interviews with children of perpetrators, and it's almost every family, this is the movie, if they ever started talking about the Holocaust, this is the TV show that made it happen. And strangely enough, the same when you look at interviews of victims of the second generation and the dialogue that was happening. Yeah, but I mean, there's so much that's so problematic about that show.
Completely, absolutely, yeah. But, and also you can think it's kind of provided a grammar kind of for subsequent, I mean, sort of told you how to tell it, where you have a Nazi family and you have a Jewish family, and you kind of can have this overview, and look at Spielberg's, it's also, you know, you have sort of Nazis and you have Jews, and they kind of have this, and almost never, if you read real memoirs, I mean, it's not like Jews like had FaceTime with Nazis, you know, they pretty much, they weren't in the ghettos, you didn't see it, it's like these worlds were not kind of parallel going along like that in some kind of contract way.
Well, I guess my question, maybe it's just more pragmatic. I was really interested, something you didn't really indicate when you were reading was when these different, and I knew some, obviously I know because Cedric, and when all these articles were made precisely.
Right.
Because it seems like a lot of the, just in broad strokes, a lot of these articles about the relationship with the archive, representative history, they almost take for granted that these historical questions are on, they're still current.
Yeah.
Whereas we live, most people in this room will live to see a world where there's no living memory of the Holocaust.
Right.
And already, you know, the Holocaust survivors, they're getting up there. They're starting to die natural deaths.
Yeah.
They've been dying natural deaths. So we're, I think, reaching a point where maybe these questions, and this is what I'm asking your opinion on, maybe these questions will be less important once that living link is gone and all we have is this memory. Because it seems like a lot of those arguments are really coming from, I don't want to say privileged position, but definitely the historically privileged position of already knowing these things and being able to say, well, we can't look at the archive. That is someone who knows already. Obviously, implicit in that is he knows already everything in the archive, more or less. Whereas, like, well, I mean, just my personal experience growing up in high school in California, you know, sophomore year world history. The big thing in the year was everyone watched Schindler's List. And as, you know, corny and all the things you just said, that was, you know, the first, maybe even the last experience, that type of, the representation of this event that a lot of these students will ever get. So it serves a purpose that I think will become more and more prominent as the years go by, and as, you know, even among the families of survivors, this stuff just becomes less current.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, everything will be. Yeah, I mean, we'll only have memories that are mediated, and we were talking about that a little bit, the future of sort of Holocaust literature, and yeah, absolutely. And Lanzmann's position, you have to think in the 70s and 80s. You know, it doesn't make any sense to kind of, and that's not really the current debate. I don't think there's much. If you look at people who are doing important work on Holocaust memory now, you know, Michael Rothberg was here talking about multi-directional memory. It's moved much beyond the kind of question of is it okay to represent, or, you know, this kind of sort of secular sacralization, if you want, of the Holocaust. I don't think is very prevalent now, but it certainly was a powerful paradigm, and Elie Wiesel and Lanzmann and a lot of really important sort of figures embraced some version of the sort of unspeakability of the Holocaust. So part of what I'm trying to do is sort of see kind of historicize, I guess, kind of that moment, but I think it has lasting effects. I think there's a lot of archival documents and just troves of Holocaust testimony and certainly a lot of millions of images that haven't been dealt with very well. What I'm most interested in my own work is going to look at a lot of narratives that were collected in DP camps, and we're talking tens of thousands of things that haven't been read, or the so-called Oleg Chavez archive and the Warsaw Ghetto, which is probably the most important Holocaust archive ever and one of the least read. It's like these documents that were buried by this clandestine group that sort of documented every aspect that they could of what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto, and buried these in a milk canister, and it was dug up after the war, and they found it, and it's almost, nobody's really worked through most of that stuff, and so that's, and I think that has a lot of complex reasons, I think, why that hasn't been done, but part of it, I think, is the sense of this very important kind of paradigm of Holocaust memory that it almost didn't matter, like this sort of, you almost have this kind of quasi-religious experience of the sublime or something, and that's the way that memory should be done, rather than actually reading and trying to kind of talk about narratives and so on. So I think it has had some, even though I don't think that's where the debate is now, I think we're still sort of feeling effects of that sort of anarchic thrust, maybe still. Yeah.
I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why do you think people think something is non-representable? I think that that's an odd historical moment that we're in, and it's obviously very familiar from religion.
Right.
Because we always say we can't say what we can't represent, and then we always spend a lot of time explaining
Exactly.
why it is that we can't represent. So there's always an ideology of non-representability. And I'm wondering what you think is the purpose and the function of that, and why are we in that moment, and the effects of it, which in fact make it a non-human event.
Mm-hmm.
And is that the upside and the downside of that theory? And I think people always think the upside is good because it shows that it's somehow super duper or beyond words.
Right.
As opposed, but it also, that which cannot be spoken is which cannot be thought.
Exactly.
Completely. So I'm just curious that really weird moment we're in,
Mm-hmm.
and why anybody would think that, as opposed to having the theory that trauma is something for which one has many, many words. In other
Right,
words,
exactly.
it's a moment of too much language, which I think could also have been what they picked, but we didn't pick that.
Right.
And I don't know, why
Yeah.
is that?
Why? That's a really yes, kind of problem. No, I'm not sure. That's a really important question. I think it's probably different for different people. I think Elie Wiesel has a sense that he's, and it's always, like you say, paradoxical, right? It's a kind of silence. It's a kind of impossibility that then is a very voluble silence, right? So he always sort of says that you can't do it, and then he tells you a lot about the Holocaust, and so and writes books about it and represents it and says that it's unrepresentable as he's doing that. So, but for him, I think it is a kind of a religious kind of reflex in some ways that he has. It's a negative kind of sacred, but it's sacred in some sense. For Lanzmann, who's a very secular guy, it still kind of has a, like you're right, it has a sacred sort of status. It's like a ring of fire, and then it's a kind of a second commandment. It's there is this prohibition of images, and I totally agree with you. I think it's really well put that the kind of Bilderverbot or the prohibition of images is really a prohibition of thinking. You shouldn't think there's somehow, but why that would be. Maybe. Well, I don't know. I don't really know. I could imagine that you could. That it could be easier, sort of, to say that it's impossible to do than to engage in a speech and to listen to actual people. To really that somehow that would be harder, and perhaps with the trauma of the Second World War and the kind of one could say the kind of the wound to maybe the narcissism of Western civilization that we had. I'm trying to think off the fly in very big terms, but that it would be easier to say, oh, that's not speakable, or we don't need to listen. That's and it wasn't so much it wasn't speakable. If you read a lot of people who talk about this, the survivors actually were pretty ready to talk, many of them, and people weren't ready to listen. So there's a kind of this sort of this kind of defining it as unspeakable is often a way of not, it's not like they tried to listen to everyone and found that survivors couldn't say anything and then said, aha, it can't be spoken. It's that they said, oh, you don't need to speak because, it's a kind of way of shutting down, I think, listening.
Yes.
And that's
yes.
Whatever the answer is, I think that has to be a key part of explaining that. It's a kind of not listening to actually a real messy cacophony of voices that were actually available and haven't always been listened to. So, it's not a full answer, but it's a partial answer.
Well, I also feel that, I don't know, I just feel like the representation of it varies so much over time and over space as well. Because, maybe in California they show you Schindler's List and call it a day, but like if you live in the Northeast, you go to the Holocaust Museum. It's a very different, that's a very different kind of material engagement with it that, that puts it in a very, that puts the Holocaust in a very different kind of place in your, if you're talking about, where it fits in your consciousness as you're growing up, like that's a very different kind of space. And it, and a space like that, I think, is constantly experimenting and mediating between silent and voiced representations. That's sort of the whole point of that museum, So I think, so I think it's just too various to characterize in a sense.
Okay.
It's 5:30, so
Thank you
thank you
very
all
much.
for coming again.
Thank you all.